My name is Arden Hangley. I've communicated with many of you in the organization of this. I'm so delighted you can all be here now. I'm one of the co-organizers of the Explorations in the Medical Humanities workshop, along with Rishi Boyle, who is with me, Joelle Avinashad, Heidi, Hausse, and Lan Lee. And I'm so glad that all of us are here together and last for today's workshop, and I appreciate that everyone else has traveled to be with us today. The goal of our workshop is embedded in the title, Explorations. Through paper presentations, collective roundtables, and informal and open discussion, we're hoping to explore some of the myriad approaches to studying the medical arts and body, health and disease through an interdisciplinary perspective. In our talks and discussions in the next 2 days, we'll work together on developing innovative ways of perceiving health, the body, and how they relate to the humanistic forces that shape medical discourse and practice. Our goal through this workshop is to build a local community of scholars at Columbia, but also an international community of scholars and practitioners who are thinking about and engaging with these questions. Would you like to add?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Sounds good. Thanks, Arden. And thank you to all our sponsors. Arden will name them individually, so we don't leave anybody out. I'm more likely to forget. I'm going to be speaking a couple of times in the next 2 days, so I'll try to keep this relatively brief. I think our hope here today is just to highlight the kind of wondrous, strange collective that is the emerging field of medical humanities. For me, I think it's a field that's marked more by its heterogeneity of approaches, methods, objects of study, than by any kind of unifying principle. However, I do hope and think that our conference will be able to highlight a politics and an ethics that is anti-colonial, anti-racist, feminist, trans, queer. You'll hear a lot of papers in the next few days. They'll be ranging across disciplines, right? From history and literary study to neuroscience and anthropology. But looking over and having read some of the papers, at least 3 themes emerged for me that I just wanted to highlight before we started. The first, I think, that's particularly important for me is just the idea of the vulnerability of bodies. And by that, I think I mean a kind of universal idea of just the vulnerability of any and all bodies, but also a kind of differential vulnerability that's sort of based on identity, right? We make some bodies more vulnerable than others. The second theme that kind of came up for me was a contesting or conflicting definition of the human, which I think is tied to obligations and rights. And I think that'll come up a few times in the papers. The third theme that really felt like it was emerging was the relationship, or the entangled relationship between the state, illness, and identity. And I think we'll see that multiple times in different ways in kind of historical and contemporary settings. Ultimately, I'm here with you all to kind of hear from our participants, to learn from each other, and to engage in a kind of lively sort of conversation. And hopefully it can be as formal and informal as we meet in the next couple of days. So thank you and welcome to the participants.
Thank you. And so before we turn it over to our first panel, I'd like to just acknowledge our generous sponsors. Our program today is supported by the Society of Fellows and the Hayden Center for the Humanities at Columbia University, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and in particular the Medicine Literature and Society undergraduate major, the Center for Science and Society, the University Seminars in Affect Studies and Disability Culture and Society, the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics, and Columbia Global Centers Paris. So we're delighted to have the support of all of those institutional participants, and thank you. So now I'd like to turn over the floor to my colleague Tillmann, who will introduce the first panel.
Thank you very much, Rishi, and welcome to our first panel, Beyond Physicians, Health and Individual Responsibility in History. I'm Tillmann, I'm a postdoc with the Making a Knowing project over in history, and I'm delighted to chair this panel, so thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. Here's what they told me to do. I shall introduce our speakers and our respondent all in one go, then we'll have the 2 papers back to back, then please, I'm sure, eloquent and wonderful response. And then there should be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So our first speaker is Meg Leja, who is an assistant professor of history at Binghamton University, and she researches the political and cultural history of ancient and medieval Europe. She has a wide range of interests across gender history, religious studies, reception and manuscript studies, and the history of science. Her current book project is called Embodying the Soul, Medicine and Religion in Carolingian Europe, and it explores changing perceptions of the body and the value of medical knowledge in the early medieval period. It examines how intellectuals and anonymous scribes wrestled with theological questions about intervening on the body and the relationship between practices of self-care and ideas of individual responsibility. Today she will be speaking about ritualizing habits, patterns, and pronouncements of bodily expertise. Our next speaker will be Alex Chase-Levenson, who is Assistant Professor of Modern European History at the University of Pennsylvania. His research in British and Mediterranean history focuses on the history of epidemic disease, which is also the topic of his book, entitled The Yellow Flag, Quarantine in the British Mediterranean World, under contract with Cambridge University Press and due to publish next year. In addition to his work on quarantine, Alex has also published articles about Egyptology and theatre in early 19th century London, and about virtual tourism at London's Crystal Palace. He's just now beginning new work on a second book about the concept of border lines and border markers in Britain and its empire during the long 19th century. Today he will be speaking to us about morals, habits, and plagues, self-regulation and epidemic disease in the 19th century. Finally, it's a pleasure to welcome back, I should say, Heidi Hausse, who was a member of the Society of Fellows in the Humanities here at Columbia, and helped build the Medical Humanities series. And in fact, she's one of the organizers of this workshop. Heidi is currently Assistant Professor of History at Auburn University, and her research is on the intersections of culture, medicine, and technology in early modern Europe, especially in the German lands. Her book project is called Life and Limb, and it examines surgical treatises and artifacts of prostheses to investigate how surgeons and artisans cut apart the human body through amputation and then work to put it back together again using the artifice of mechanical limbs. She just had an article come out in the January issue of Technology and Culture, which is called The Locksmith, the Surgeon, and the Mechanical Hand, Communicating Technical Knowledge in Early Modern Europe. Please join me in welcoming all three.
Okay, thanks so much, Tillmann, and thanks so much, Heidi, and everyone else for organizing this. I'm really excited, and yeah, it seems like a great topic and lots of interesting papers. So, in the year 801, the 20-year-old son of the Carolingian Emperor Charlemagne was about to set off on a campaign in southern Italy. Accompanying and counseling him was one Count Hrodgaud, a nobleman whom Charlemagne clearly trusted with the life of Pippin. As he prepared for the expedition, Hrodgaud received a friendly letter from one of the emperor's closest advisors, a monk named Alcuin, who was then presiding over the monastery of Tours. In light of the dangers that he and Pippin might face in Italy, Alcuin urged the count to consider his eternal fate and protect the health of his soul by giving alms, acting with justice and mercy, and offering wise counsel to the prince. We might assume that Alcuin was thinking primarily of the military dangers awaiting the count in Italy, but his fears extended into all aspects of bodily health, and he inserted a warning about illness in the midst of his spiritual warnings. You know very well how dangerous it is there in southern Italy on account of the pestilential air of that region, perhaps picturing a landscape like this. The count needed to remain vigilant, Alcuin stressed, words of advice that he had also impressed upon a pupil of his who was traveling to the same place. Italy is an unhealthy country and produces harmful foods, so consider very carefully what and when you eat, and especially avoid addiction to drunkenness, for fever develops in the heat of wine if you are not careful. Bad air and bad food may not be the first things that we associate with Italy, but Alcuin obviously assumed that Hrodgaud would already be familiar with the unhealthy miasmas and noxious food and drink that made any campaign in Italy much more treacherous. In his letter, the well-read Abbot of Tours did not spell out the particular steps the Count ought to take to protect his bodily health, which likewise suggests that he expected this nobleman to already know something about the regimen he should follow while on campaign in this pestilential region. However, that a Carolingian count in the 9th century would be learned in the theory of medical regimens does not in any way fit within our broader periodizations of the history of medicine. These proclaim that after the end of the Western Roman Empire around the 5th century, there witnessed a steep decline in medical learning, as literacy and education in general moved increasingly within the monastic cloister. Rather than the eloquent writings of Galen, the Latin regions were reading what essentially amounted to medical junk, right? Cobbled together codices of herbals, head-to-toe remedies for different ailments, and short treatises denuded of detailed medical theory. Medicine in Europe, as this narrative goes, would not be redeemed until the late 11th century, when Arabic medical literature, which was firmly rooted in Galen's rational thought, began to be translated into Latin in southern Italy and Spain. To be sure, the degree of barbarity within early medieval medical culture has faced challenges. But the pull of a dark age abyss, right, out of which knowledge has to struggle to emerge, has proven, perhaps unsurprisingly, amazingly resilient. Thus, we are left with the framework of monastic medicine as a way to periodize and account for this weird blip in the early Middle Ages. Indeed, the very term monastic medicine implicitly suggests an oxymoron. For how could monks, intent on mortifying their bodies, devote themselves to an art of medicine that was rational rather than religious? At the same time, monastic medicine connotes a tradition hidden away. Medical knowledge might be preserved within the cloister, but outside of it was a lay warrior society that couldn't care less about education, literacy, or the finer points of medical doctrine. This was a world in which the strict divide between the sacred and the profane had to be maintained, and medicine was trapped on one side. So these are the types of stereotypes haunting the care of the body in the early Middle Ages. And they leave little space for our Count Crodcar. They also fail, for the most part, to acknowledge the rapid religious transformations sweeping society in the 8th and 9th centuries. Transformations that emphasize the importance of individual responsibility in maintaining the good order of a Christian empire. Here, I'm arguing that the religious movement included an increased emphasis on maintaining physical health as a crucial part of the good care of the soul. I focus particularly on the stomach as the bodily organ in which the connection between daily habits of bodily practice and spiritual health is rendered most explicit. By drawing attention to preventative medicine rather than the treatment of disease or debility, and by breaking down a clear distinction between practical and theoretical medicine, we gain a better understanding of the reconfigurations of bodily expertise taking place toward the end of the early Middle Ages. Before examining in more detail the medical horizons of the Carolingian laity, it's important to acknowledge the types of healing activities that were taking place within monasteries at this time. So first, monks and nuns seem to have fostered an active interest in medical knowledge, and we have approximately 70 manuscripts with medical material that survive from the 9th century alone. And most of these were probably copied at monastic scriptoria. And I know 70 may not seem like a lot to people who studied later periods of history, but the early Middle Ages, 70 manuscripts is a pretty big number of manuscripts on medicine. This is a significant number. And in fact, it's a dramatic increase from the handful of texts that survive, really just a few from before the year 800. Furthermore, no two of these manuscripts are alike. In fact, no two are a copy of one another. And this points, in fact, towards a much larger circulation of material that's now lost. And I propose that this is partly because these manuscripts were actually being used in the treatment of patients. So if we look at this manuscript in particular, it begins with a Lobotomy Treatise, and it survives, you can tell that it was folded up, suggesting that perhaps it was actually carried around by an itinerant physician, right? Being carried around is more likely to degrade, hence why we probably lost a lot of the manuscripts that were actually in existence in the 9th century. Treatments like bloodletting, okay, this text begins with a bloodletting treatise, were definitely taking place within the monastic cloister. So if we look here at an architectural schema for an ideal monastery, and this is called the St. Gall plan, and it's produced around the year 820, you can see that there's a whole room, in fact, dedicated to bloodletting and the administration of purgatives within the monastery. And this room is actually part of a much larger healthcare complex that sits on one edge of the monastery and includes rooms for the very infirm, includes a house for physicians, a drug storeroom, a bathhouse, and a separate kitchen where meals with meat could be cooked for sick monks. A Carolingian council, so a council of bishops, kings, noblemen, in 816, declared that monks should be allowed to receive bloodletting as often as they required for the sake of illness. And monastic rules stipulated that monastics ought to show charity in caring for their sick brothers and sisters. But was it only monastics who were treated within these healthcare complexes? And the typical answer has been yes, because of the importance that early medieval society placed on maintaining the purity of the cloister, right, this holy ground. You couldn't have lay people enter. But observe in the plan the way that the healthcare complex actually sits away from the main church and the main cloister of the monks, right? It's off in one corner there. It also aligns with spaces like the school and the guest house, in which probably lay people were also received. And many 9th century manuscripts copied at male monasteries include gynecological information of the sort that would have been pertinent for a laywoman, right, who may have come to the monks seeking assistance with fertility, with pregnancy, and other related diseases. So in practice, I think the boundaries of the monastery were quite permeable, and cloistered medical expertise was accessible to the layperson who desired to seek it out. But this approach still roots us in the belief that it was primarily qualified healers for whom medical texts and knowledge of the body was useful. If we instead focus on medicine as self-care, the contours of the medical are broadened, and it becomes easier to bring laymen like Crodgar into our picture. If we're interested in the lay nobility's conception of the care of the self, the 9th century is a transitional moment, because it was just before 800 that the first advisory handbooks addressed explicitly to elite laymen were composed. And here I'm going to mention these three. There are 3 lay manuals by Bishop Politeness of Aquileia, Alcuin of Tours, and Bishop Jonas of Orleans. And these were written for prominent counts and dukes within the realm, as you can see, over the space of about 30 years or so. These are short handbooks of various precepts regarding how to live a pious life while involved in worldly affairs like the military, administration of justice, and marriage. Historians have focused particularly on what these manuals have to say about sex. But in fact, they are much more concerned with issues of consumption and diet than they are of sex. And they present a vision of the ethical life grounded, in part, in the maintenance of physical health. In taking up the question of inner vice, the authors of the manuals were dealing with the regulation of a body situated in space and time, and thus perpetually subject to corruption. They encourage the cultivation of what I'm calling a kind of mindfulness towards the inner, invisible self. This was an orientation that also encompassed the inward recesses of the body, recesses that were just as hidden and just as threatening to social order as the private workings of the soul. It was as a result of Adam and Eve's desire to eat, as Politeness explains to Count Eric, that sin first corrupted humanity. And the repercussions of the first couple's sin, then, was to rob humanity of temperance and to make it intemperate, a physical condition that then brought forth disease, Politeness states. Drawing on a particularly vivid set of metaphorical images, the bishop urges Eric to be vigilant in his soul's direction of its body. And here I'm going to go back to this image of a chariot. So this quote is found in Politeness's manual. Just as bridles must be set on horses, thus our bodies must be bridled by fasts and prayers. For in the same way that charioteers, if they loosen the reins, are drawn into great danger, thus also the soul, with its body, if we do not set a bridle on it, will fall into the dangers of hell. Too much food hurts very much, not only our souls, but also our bodies. For the strength of the stomach is accustomed to be shattered through too much greed for food, and by a large amount of food is drawn in an abundance of blood and bile and very many sicknesses. Just as those things are contrary to the health of the soul and the body, thus the cure for both is a moderate fast. So here we see Politeness drawing attention to the power of excess food and drink to harm the stomach, provoke humoral superfluity, and consequently upset the health of the body and damage the state of the soul. He borrowed this passage from a 6th century work for monks, where excessive eating was discussed because of how it impeded a monk's ability to stay awake during vigils. Politeness extracted this passage from a context specifically about vigils then, and adapted it to a precept for daily life, a precept on the importance of monitoring the stomach that ought to be followed by the entire Carolingian lay elite. The manuals by Alcuin and Jonas directed similar attention to diet, insisting that an individual must sustain an acute awareness of the quality and quantity of food being ingested, receiving enough to rebuild the stomach, and avoiding delicate foods or overconsumption, which weaken and weigh down the body. About 50 years after Politeness wrote, the monk Hildemar at the monastery of Taape wrote a spiritual manual directed to monks that also highlighted this nexus of organs around the stomach. He began a chapter devoted to food in the monastic life by drawing a provocative comparison between the advice of a medicus, or a doctor, this is the Latin term for doctor in the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, and the mandates of God. Just as a most skilled medicus says to his patient when he sees him sick, abstain from this food and that food, because unless you abstain from these foods, then you will fall into great illness. Thus also the Lord said, pay attention, lest your hearts be weighed down with temporal concerns. Christians heed the advice of the earthly physician, Hildemar explains, how much more should they heed the advice of the heavenly one? Such comparisons between the human doctor and the heavenly physician had been around for many centuries, but they were newly popular in the Carolingian period, and the various lay manuals that I mentioned all invoke this metaphor of Christ the physician. This metaphor tends, at base, to present a dualistic mode of thought, which depended upon the implicit assumption that the health of the body was a foil for the health of the soul. Remedies for sickness could be likened to spiritual remedies to aid in Christian teaching, but the soul's well-being was of such infinitely greater importance than that of the body that the two were essentially incomparable. So thus, at first glance, Hildemar's metaphor seems to refer to medical dietary advice as a mere analogy for spiritual precepts. However, our author immediately follows this metaphor with a technical description of the perils of overconsumption, focusing on the mechanics of the digestive process. For overconsumption is understood to occur at the point when food is ingested in surplus, and hence the person is weighed down. For the stomach of a person is a cavity which is like a pot near the liver, and their food is hidden away, and it is cooked by the heat of the liver. Hence, when food is taken in beyond measure in a person's stomach, it is not able to be cooked by the heat of the liver, and as a result, the smoke of the food ascends through the members to the head. Consequently, the person is weighed down and belches, just as from an illness. And that person grows so weak that he is not able to do any good work. In inserting this physiological account, Hildemar moves away from his initial dualistic approach to body and soul toward an understanding of the earthly medicus's dietary advice as itself essential to spiritual health. It is not simply that dietary warnings against excess are like Christ's warnings about temporal burdens. It is that overconsumption and the havoc it wreaks on the stomach is inimical to spiritual progress. Raw food produces real material impurity in the body. The polluted smoke that rises from stomach to head affects the soul's ability to function. I haven't been able to trace Hildemar's exact wording in that quote I read out to any one medical text. However, the emphasis on excess and the physiological harm it causes within the body is the same kind of language one finds in medical treatises popular during the Carolingian period. Indeed, the way in which Hildemar discusses the cooking process of digestion and its perversion that remains raw or uncooked and produces corrupt gases able to travel throughout the body and thereby harm other organs, is remarkably similar to one of the more popular dietary texts from the 9th century. And this is a letter attributed to one Anthemus and addressed to a layman among the Frankish nobility. Anthemus declares that he has provided a rule of observation culled from the teachings of medical authorities. The text addresses each category of food in turn: grain, meat, fowl, eggs, fish, vegetables, pulses, dairy, and fruit, detailing which selection is best from each category and how to prepare it. The basic premise is that the stomach is a cooker. Those foods that are already well cooked before entering the body, Anthemus explains, are more easily broken down by the stomach and turned into good humors. Any food that is raw is to be avoided, as are overly cold foods that might dampen the heat of the stomach, or foods that are dense, dry, and heavy, and thus might not cook properly. Beware the person who does not follow these rules. He or she will be weighed down by rawness, beset by bad-smelling gases that rise towards the head, and suffer violent belching and vomiting. Keep that in mind the next time you're out with friends. Certain key binaries run through the text: heavy versus light, indigestible versus digestible, rotten or raw versus cooked, and decay versus health. The central maxim of Anthemus's letter accords closely with other medical and moral treatises. Everything in excess is harmful. Anthemus's treatise seeks to cultivate a sense of urgency in the reader, warning him or her that it is of the utmost importance to pay personal heed to the selection and preparation of foods, since good digestion is the root of distinguished health. Quote, "We must govern ourselves such that we are not weighed down by excess, but obtain health by behaving more moderately. We have presented these instructions with the help of divine majesty and our Lord Jesus Christ." The status of the Frankish nobility is manifested by their self-control over dietary choices in the face of diversity, right? They have options, but they choose wisely. The historian Bonnie Ephros has suggested that the ubiquity of this text in Carolingian medical manuscripts is reflective of how it came to be primarily used in the monastic treatment of the sick. And yet, I would say, a guide to be employed in reaction to illness was emphatically not what Anthemus declared his text to be, namely preventative medicine. It was intended to purify the inner self by purging rawness, to guide the individual in maintaining temperance in the face of sinful excess, and to prepare the body to meet the insalubrity of foreign climes like Italy. Like Politeness and the other authors of the lay manuals, Anthemus urged the fighting and feasting warrior elite of the early Middle Ages to engage in new techniques of self-governance. The laity was taught that morality did not simply rest on avoiding the vice of gluttony, but rather that morality was a vigilance directed toward the regulation of internal physical processes that could be harmful to the soul's health. By focusing on the stomach and its crucial function within the body, we can see currents of knowledge and practice that cross the lay monastic boundary and the nominal boundary between the body and soul. In fact, although we are working with very little evidence for this period, we have a fairly clear picture that the lay nobility did actually own medical manuscripts. So we only have 2 wills that survive from the Carolingian period. One is from the Count of Friuli and his wife, and the other is from the Count of Mâcon. Both of these indicate that medical works constituted a small percentage of each noble family's library. The Count of Mâcon, as you can see here, owned 1 book of medicine, probably a compilation of treatises, herbs, and remedies, the type of book that may well have included Anthemus's treatise, and 2 books of prognostics, probably a collection on the humoral effects of the seasons, a list of days safe for bloodletting, and dietary calendars arranged according to month. The Count of Friuli, meanwhile, owned a manuscript ascribed to a physician, the Physiognomy of Lopus the Medicus. This work opens with a statement on the practical applicability of physiognomy. To observe and investigate from the quality of the body, the quality of the soul. For Lopus established that blood is the home of the soul, and the body gives forth diverse signs according to the strength or weakness of the blood. Thus, this text offers one explanation of why diet was deemed so essential to spiritual health. Through digestion, food was turned into blood and other humors, and because blood was the home of the soul, its purity had the potential to directly affect this spiritual, eternal substance. Certainly, the Carolingians argued for the immaterial nature of the soul, right, as part of kind of more long-standing Christian doctrine. But they also sought for ways to fix it firmly within the body. A text that circulates in Carolingian medical manuscripts described the soul using the language of nested Russian dolls. The skin encloses the flesh, which encloses the veins, which enclose the blood, which encloses the breath and vital heat, which encloses the soul. The soul is thus shown to be distinct from the blood, yet intimately connected with the well-being of the blood in the body. A prominent scholar of the Carolingian court composed a herbal on different garden plants in the middle of the 9th century, in which he referred to the stomach as the king of the body. Such an idea infuses the medical literature of the age, which portrays the stomach as the site of processes that brought together the material and spiritual worlds. While monasteries were certainly important sites of medicine, both textual and applied, what stands out most about the early Middle Ages is the growing perception of the individual as a medicalized self. This is over 6 centuries before the printing press would make widely available vernacular regimen literature for the middle classes. But already in the 9th century, we see an assumption among the elite that medical learning was an asset. And we see that the medical writings that were particularly popular fed into a common discourse on self-governance, found in a new genre of advisory manuals. Together, these trained counts like Hrodgaard to be ever mindful of the dangers that lurked in a raw piece of meat or a bit of indigestible cheese. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meg. As I said, hold your questions and we'll move straight on to the next paper.
Is it plugged in all the way?
Yes. Awesome. Felt like it was plugging in more, so. Okay, so jumping 1,000 years into the future from Meg's talk, but still not up until, to anything like the present. So, morals, habits, and plagues. Robert Walsh, a chaplain in the service of Britain's Levant Trading Company, traveled from Istanbul to Britain, back to Britain, overland. And as any traveler would have been while making that precise route in the first half of the 19th century, Walsh was forced to undergo a quarantine at one of the many lazarettos along the Ottoman frontier, in this case an encampment in the Carpathian Mountains at the Rotenturm Pass, the Red Tower Pass on the frontier with Habsburg, Austria. Suffice it to say that Walsh was not impressed at all with the accommodations he was shown. "If fear and alarm be depressing passions," he wrote, "and so, according to the best medical opinions, be predisposing causes to the reception of contagion, a more effectual way could not be described to cause the disease to develop itself than by treating a man who had come from just where it was, i.e. the Ottoman Empire, as if he had the disease upon him, and shutting him up in a filthy, dismal room, the very look and atmosphere of which seemed contagious." Disease, in Walsh's framing, seems to come from a complex interaction and from multiple sources, from external contagions, from environments, and also from his own mind, with fear and alarm. Well, again, Walsh's first view of his nasty temporary accommodations occurred about 1,000 years after your talk, Meg, but views of disease in the early 19th century were based on surprisingly similar conceptions, indeed that had existed since classical antiquity. What's new is a kind of formal enunciation of a doctrine of contagion, in the case of epidemic diseases, an innovation of the 16th century. Now, over the next 200 years, so it's still well before germ theory is a thing, and this talk is entirely from the period before germ theory is a thing, contagionism becomes the kind of accepted explanation for bubonic plague in Western Europe, and for a few other major epidemic diseases. After the 1720 plague epidemic of Marseille, bubonic plague became extinct in Western Europe, almost entirely. Until the 1840s, it remained a frequent scourge of North Africa and the Ottoman Empire, setting up a kind of cross-Mediterranean epidemiological imbalance that justifies this very onerous quarantine system. And as a result, between the mid-18th century and about 1850, every single traveler like Walsh, every trader, every ship, every sailor, trade good, letter, animal, vegetable, mineral, venturing from the Ottoman Empire to the West was required to undergo quarantine on arrival in a European port. And especially before the 1840s, quarantine often lasted around 18 to 20 days. And that's in the case of a clean bill of health. So a ship that proceeded from a Middle Eastern city where there's no actual report of epidemic diseases. If there's a foul bill of health, it was usually 40 days, hence the word quarantine from quaranta in Italian. Speaking to a room of scholars whose research no doubt carries you all around the world, I'd suggest you could think of the frustration of an exceptionally long passport control line when you get off, say, a red-eye flight. And imagine instead a passport control line that's 3 weeks long and proceeding in a building that looks like this. It's a very ominous re-entry point to the continent of Europe. Undergirding the fact that ideological positions, so explanations for how epidemic diseases spread, had serious consequences. And quarantine, as would not surprise you, presumably, was exceptionally controversial, especially in the 19th century. It lasts about, this mandatory universal system of detention lasts 15 years after the first steam navigation routes across the Mediterranean. So the actual period of detention is much, much longer than the voyage itself. Opponents of quarantine, who are typically called anti-contagionists or miasmatists, typically stressed neo-Hippocratic explanations for disease, where environmental factors, marsh exhalations, similar to the image you showed of this picture of southern Italy, wind patterns, sudden changes of atmosphere, temperature, these explain how epidemics arise. The debate between contagionists, defenders of the idea that touch or proximity to sick individuals causes plague or other epidemic diseases, and anti-contagionists who blame atmosphere, is bitter, vituperative, and nasty. And that's in part because of the stakes. Defenders of quarantine believed anti-contagionists were essentially in the pocket of merchants, were dangerously willing to sacrifice the health of Europeans
for the commercial benefit of abolishing quarantine. Quarantine is obviously extraordinarily expensive, both the costs of paying for quarantine guardians, fumigation procedures, and also for the delays it entails, with every bale of cotton coming from Egypt back to Western Europe, for example, being fumigated for 3 weeks. Anti-contagionists, meanwhile, see themselves as the progressive empirical scientists of their day. Quarantine, they claimed, was useless and even counterproductive. The balance of the evidence is about evenly split in the early 19th century between anti-contagionism and contagionism. Different anecdotes about particular plague outbreaks seemed conclusive depending on who was telling them. Well, you'll note that I called this paper Morals and Habits, and so far we haven't heard much about either of those things and how they were held to be responsible for the spread of epidemic disease. But the contagion debate in the 19th century is part of that story. Anti-contagionists tried to criticize contagionism by pointing out that if plague is so easy to communicate that the mere presence of a ship from the Middle East with no evident plague on board could spread a devastating plague, essentially everyone in the world would be dead. In other words, if contact spread disease and incubation periods were at least a month long before you displayed any symptom whatsoever, presumably there would be a lot more plague than there was. Yet contagionists could note the same problem in anti-contagionist thinking. If temperature, if atmospheric factors did not cause plague for everyone in a particular locality, the same problem applies. Why didn't plague kill everybody where there is a sudden change in temperature, where the marsh exhalation is particularly noxious? So partisans on both sides of the debate are on the hunt for predisposing causes that could explain why some people got sick and others remained well. Well, you didn't have to be a doctor to be immersed in this question. Lay people of all kinds tried to explain why, in the time of a plague, sickness was visited on some people, but others remained healthy. For Western expatriates living in the Middle East, and here we see a later 19th century view of Para, the European quarter of Istanbul, plague is an ever-present threat, and it's a part of identifying as a Western European living in expatriate in a Middle Eastern city that you follow certain quarantine procedures to respond to the plague. This procedure called shutting up, where you employ a rigorous self-quarantine the entire duration of a plague epidemic. Stories abounded about the dire consequences of those who let down their guard. One told of a British man who felt he needed a haircut in the middle of a plague epidemic, stuck his head outside of a gate in a shut-up house, and was dead 3 days later. Or so the story went. Doctors found many of these anecdotes to be completely absurd, even as they traded in them in their own medical treatises. The medical traveler R.R. Madden complained of the omnipresence of discussions about the plague while in Egypt, writing, "The laws of infection were handled by young ladies in a drawing room. Quote, a cat could communicate the plague, but a dog was less dangerous. An ass was a pestiferous animal, but a horse was non-contagious. If you complained of a headache, there was a general flight. If you went abroad with a sallow cheek, the people fled in all directions. Heaven preserve you from a quarantine in Egypt. It is not the death of one's neighbors which is so overcoming, but the horror of eternally hearing of the plague. It is the terror of contagion, which is depicted in every face, the presentation of pestilential apparitions and discourses to the eye and to the ear, morning, noon, and night." Popular anxiety about epidemics translated into attempts to create rules for understanding who got sick and who stayed well. This comforts people to come up with them. It's an impulse that makes me think of the episode of Frasier, when the eponymous character is so unnerved by a man of a similar age dying all of a sudden, that he barges into that man's Shiva sitting to ask desperately probing questions that could establish any kind of difference between them that could make him feel better, and make him feel that he wasn't about to keel over and die. Even eminent doctors in the 19th century discussed what they called the caprice of epidemic diseases, noting that the big three of 19th century epidemics, that's plague, cholera, and yellow fever, all shared this kind of freaky characteristic of hitting victims in a way that could seem random. In a way, this is part of a broad trend of personifying epidemic diseases. So King Cholera is a frequent moniker for that disease during its spin through the sewage of the English-speaking world in the 1830s and 40s, and here from the 1890s is a German artist's depiction of the plague. Well, did the caprice of these personified diseases have rules? Were there patterns? In a way, the multiplicity of medical theories surrounding disease transmission fostered a popular sense that hypervigilance was incredibly necessary. A synthesis of medical arguments might be avoid filth, avoid the yeast, avoid confined environments, avoid the sick, avoid those who communicated with the sick, and in the words of the plague writer, Dr. Patrick Russell, trust no one, lest they should be guilty of irregularities. Contagionists and anti-contagionist precepts created a large set of things to avoid that could mesh together for ordinary consumers of second or third-hand information. And medical disagreement fostered individual theories and traditions that cast blame for the plague in all kinds of directions. So that returns us to Robert Walsh, a chaplain and a travel writer, but also someone quite interested in the plague. Walsh professed himself to be a contagionist, yet he clearly believed that fear itself could cause the plague, a position shared by many authors, medical doctors and lay writers alike. The more level-headed you could remain, the safer you might be. Such is the clear thinking behind what is perhaps the most famous painting to comment on the etiology of the plague, and that would be Antoine Gros' Bonaparte touchant les pestiférés de Jaffa, Bonaparte touching the plague victims of Jaffa, where he famously shows he is full of imperial sang-froid by touching the bubo of someone suffering from bubonic plague and sort of overcoming it with the power of his own civilizing mission. Well, one can see how this etiology of personality lent itself to broad cultural essentialism. Here it seems to be a justification for Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. Yet, if some commentators suggested that so-called Islamic fatalism lay behind the tenacity of plague in the Middle East, others stressed that this mindset, this supposed fatalistic mindset, actually gave Muslims an advantage when it came to the plague. In contrast to Europeans, whose, quote, vain terrors and pusillanimous apprehensions during epidemics left them more vulnerable to the plague, argued the British merchant Thomas Thornton, the Turks, from temperance, from consequent robustness of constitution, and from firmness of mind, frequently escape after infection. So again, looking at kind of cultural variables, but here coming up with a more positive spin, the fact that Muslims are told not to drink alcohol, Thornton is saying actually preserves them from the plague and makes Europeans more vulnerable. Charles MacLean, a prolific and polemic anti-contagionist who had personally survived the plague, similarly considered apparent Islamic rejection of quarantine to be a rejection of the kind of fear that could actually itself cause the disease. Inquiries undertaken by the British Parliament and French Academy of Medicine between the 1820s and 40s returned again and again to the question of whether the plague hit certain ethnic groups, certain cultures, more than others. A culture, went the implicit assumption, entailed a set of characteristics, habits, and rituals. It must either predispose or preserve those who belong to it from epidemic disease. Politicians who opposed quarantine told themselves that their opposition was grounded in rational thought. But confidence that countries like Britain, the Netherlands, and Prussia could avoid the plague was clearly based on a sense that there's something ineffable about the coldness of Northern Europe and the moderation of Northern habits that was itself sufficient antidote against disease. Well, I'm a British historian, so my focus is there, and few ideas seem to me more quintessentially British than the idea of the bracing power of a gust of cold air, or the comforting balm of moderation between extremes, though you wouldn't know it if you've been following the Brexit debates of the past few weeks. It should be far from a surprise that the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears emerged from 19th century Britain. The performance of a central plank of national identity, then, could be seen as a talisman of health, moderation. And the idea that it's obviously healthy, certainly predates 19th century Britain. It goes back to antiquity and the idea of humoral balance. But I'd suggest it has special saliency at this time because of the way it intersects with certain visions of national identity popular in the late Georgian and early Victorian age. In W.T. Moncrief's smash hit historical melodrama of 1829, The Pestilence of Marseille, a character turns to the audience at the conclusive finale and warns them, if you value your lives and don't want to have your town another Marseille, you'll all of you mount guard like lynxes. Why lynxes in particular, I don't know. So long before sanitary reformers advocate a program of public health reform, audiences could have inferred the kinds of things this might entail. J.T. Conquest's 1848 Letters to a Mother warned mothers that food of a hot, stimulating nature would impair the energy of the whole system and become the predisposing cause of a variety of diseases. Indeed, he warned, there is nothing more dangerous than pastry shops, with their rich and vile dainties, read French, which are indigestible and pall the appetite and produce sickness and fever. After all, wondered another author, John Charles Hall, may not the purple and fine linen, he's imagining a table that looks something like this, the champagne, the turtle, the high seasoned food tend to shorten life for the rich as effectively as the pestilential odors carried to the lungs of the poor. So this is actually the same as that. Moral and medical intuitions obviously go hand in hand in this kind of advice. Again, moderation between extremes. And it's internalized not only by those who fought epidemics like cholera at home, but by travelers and expatriates who contended with plague abroad. Indeed, outside of Britain and in the midst of an ostensibly unhealthy climate, vigilance needed to be comparatively greater. Too many travelers, argued the travel writer E.D. Clark, venture to live as they would in their own country, upon a meat diet with beer and wine. To Clark, what might seem like a normal meal in Britain was in fact a source of plague if consumed in the Middle East. And in the time of cholera, the same rules apply. So if one examines the advice on this handbill from the 1832 cholera epidemic, one sees that enhanced temperance is constituted as a general way to ward off disease, and the avoidance of raw vegetables and fruit that isn't ripe. You'll notice how similar this advice is to the current advice one might actually be given if one had a stomach bug today. Eat extremely mild food. Only here, the order is actually reversed. The cultivation of the behavior appears to trick the disease into staying away, or at least that's the hope of the people writing handbills like this. With epidemic disease, of course, with no known cure for cholera, for plague, or yellow fever, not getting sick was the central struggle. And with the advice about avoiding food that was difficult to digest, we get a hint of what is one of the truly strangest ideas in the 18th and 19th century epidemic medical imagination. And that's the idea of the late 17th century Dr. Thomas Sydenham of an epidemic constitution. The idea that in the midst of an epidemic, an invisible poison in the air could transform the ordinary atmosphere into a malignant foreign cloud. Quote, the prevailing disease swallows up all other disorders, explained a writer in New York's Medical Repository in 1820. During the prevalence of an epidemic plague, typhus, dysentery, or other disease of this class, every indisposition of a febrile sort readily assumes the character of the prevailing disease. In such a time, a specific virus of the atmosphere, writes this author, assimilates the impurities of the air into a poison like itself. Even healthy individuals could not escape this influence. As an article in the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal suggested, during a plague epidemic, people who escape, quote, a positive and marked attack of the epidemic, nevertheless feel phantom pains in the groins and armpits, as if they're being attacked by buboes. So epidemic is a very creepy idea. Epidemic disease touched everyone in this narrative, in this understanding. It transformed the customary epidemiological state of a nation. In applying this idea to cholera, the Dr. G.W. Lefebvre, a British doctor observing the disease in Russia, showed just how thoroughly cholera could transform the customary landscape. Writing in 1831, it was observed that this malady, as Sydenham observed of the plague, that there was, during its prevalence, what he called a constitutio epidemica, or that all kinds, or the greatest part at least, of the reigning distempers are converted into this prevailing epidemic. If the cholera hits Britain, he warned, quote, imprudence and excesses of the table, which might in the normal course of things lead to an ordinary bowel affection, would in the present case generate a cholera morbus. So eating moderately and not upsetting your stomach is a life and death matter for Hall. It could potentially save your life to eat extremely moderately, because any kind of twinge that's just normal and easy to ignore in the normal state of things could become a deadly cholera. One sees here a complex interchange between the notion of the air itself literally bringing disease and individual habits, morals, and willpower being used to counteract it. For many people during the cholera epidemic, the clearest way possible to avoid disease seemed to be to deny there was any disease at all the so-called cholera humbug movement. This is usually interpreted in social histories of cholera as a sign of resentment by the urban poor, that high-handed elites are kind of inventing cholera as an excuse to push people around, to force them into isolation hospitals, to close stores, to impose curfews. And that's clearly part of it. But there's also an aspect of this effort to deny the existence of epidemic disease that corresponds with the implicit prophylactic advice even doctors are endorsing, the sense that fear itself is a predisposing cause, a situation that gives FDR's nothing to fear but fear itself a literal meaning. Well, so far we've explored the compatibility of essentially anti-contagious mechanisms of disease transmission and personal habits, atmosphere, epidemic constitutions, foreign climates, with temperance, moderation, and equanimity being the prescription's order. Yet in this final part of my talk, I want to explore the intersections between individual habits, rituals, and behaviors and contagionist understandings of disease transmission. One would think little could be left to individual behavior if one believed in contagion, other than just saying, avoid the sick. And yet consider quarantine itself, the quintessential practice of a contagious worldview. Quarantine was not only a set time of penance or probation, as one traveler called it, but an accumulation of ritual practices. It is not an accident that quarantine was something one performed in common discourse. It involved a vast set of procedures, precise wigglings for bales of cotton versus cords of silk, detailed recipes for fumigating liquids, incredibly complex distinctions, as you see in the list in the middle, between items of the first class of contagious transmissibility and items of comparatively less vulnerability to contagion. These are minute distinctions. They all justify incredibly complex procedures. Importantly, boards of health and defenders of quarantine did not typically justify their practices with reference to explicit medical theories, so much as they did by invoking Europe's apparent invulnerability to the plague after 1720. Tradition, not theory, then, underlay quarantine and was its most potent argument. A critic of the practice said it amounted to little more than fate, fiction, and dread, dubbing it the 40-day farce. But in the face of massive uncertainty over the actual mechanism of epidemic transmission, it was very hard to justify changing procedures at all. Who knew what the conclusive detail would turn out to have been? Experimentation in this way seemed absolutely indefensible. And so the ritual practices of the lazarettos, the quarantine stations, came to take on a kind of magical quality. Sanitation was literally being performed at the border to guarantee the health of the body politic. And so before moving to some concluding remarks, I want to return to Robert Walsh's experience of quarantine at the Red Tower Pass and examine its end. He survived the 3 weeks, you'll be pleased to know, in the room he found so contagious looking. And on the final day of his quarantine, he wrote, quote, "The last day of 3 weeks' detention at length passed over, and the next I was informed I was at liberty to depart. The doctor came by candlelight in the morning. His man brought a pan of charcoal, on which he threw a few pinches of niter, and then slowly, and holding the smoking pan, he walked around me in a circle like a magician, and so I was purified and free to go." So in the very end of a quarantine, ritual, and not a clear understanding of incubation periods or the nature of contagion, marked the conclusive moment of purification. So, to conclude, in the history of public health, epidemics are typically treated on the level of populations. Historians judge whether countries are primarily quarantinist or sanitarian, that is to say contagionist or anti-contagionist, taking their cue from administrative archives where nervous bureaucrats treated epidemic disease as a possible moment of civilizational collapse. Epidemics impel the historical gaze to the macro level. It's an important point of view, but here I'm trying to argue that it has validity only within a complex relationship with individual behavior, a second understanding of epidemics. On all sides of medical ideology, habits, rituals, morals, and emotions were important variables that could determine health. Epidemic disease could serve as such a strong impetus for social change because it jives so well with conceptions of individual moral responsibility. The advice you got in an epidemic was not so different, in other words, from advice dispensed in general. Avoid rich pastries, don't drink alcohol, try to keep a calm and steady mind. So when we look at the rhetoric of public health reformers and note how much they transformed their sewer policies into a moral crusade, perhaps we're looking at the phenomenon in reverse. Individual behavior and individual morals were already an established part of epidemic medicine, and in adopting a program on a macro level with language that also applied on the level of individuals, public health reformers elicited broad support. In other words, the fight against the plague had to happen on both the level of the state and the level of the home. And finally, for no particular reason other than serving as a public service announcement, I will end with a piece of advice for avoiding the plague taken from Moncrief's Pestilence of Marseille. Planning how to avoid the disease, the hero's mother-in-law swears that onions are excellent against contagion. And her son-in-law adds, especially when there's a good rump steak in the middle of them. Remember these words, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you both for two really wonderful papers. And then continue with this response.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So I am so delighted for the opportunity to respond to two such wonderful papers. I enjoyed reading the drafts that you sent so much in preparation of this response, and I enjoyed even more listening to you give them now, so thank you. So when organizing this panel, I spoke with Meg and Alex about an ambition to bring together scholars who work on different time periods and contexts, get them to present their work, and then have an open dialogue around a common theme or methodology or both to spark a truly productive conversation about how they approach the medical humanities. I wanted this panel to create a moment in which we step outside of our field specialties as the co-organizers and I hope that this workshop at large helps us step out of our disciplinary specialties to talk about each other's work and our working methods. And in that moment, perhaps find new questions about what we do that we hadn't considered before, and new answers to questions that we thought we understood already from the perspectives of our own specialties. And this is a challenge to bring to two historians working on very different things, right? When I'm saying it will make sense in the panel at the time, right? So someone who's working on 9th century Carolingian medicine, the body, and religious transformation, and somebody who's working on 19th century contagion with a focus on Great Britain. So I presented this challenge to them, and they were game, and I think they just killed it. So thank you so much for your papers and your presentations. So from a cursory look, right, it looks like I would say the three of us don't have much in common beyond the fact that we're historians, that we work on different periods that have to do with Europe, and we have some interest in medicine. But through this panel, through these excellent papers, we hit on a theme that all three of us are actually really passionate about, and that's the role of the individual and of self-care, of what's been termed in both papers a moral responsibility even, of laypersons within the history of medicine. And so we titled this panel Beyond Physicians because that seemed to be the direction we were going in, right? We wanted to have a conversation about this theme of lay medical practice, which looks a lot like preventative medicine in the two papers that we just listened to. And this idea of preventative medicine that seems to be tied tightly to perceptions of morality, I would say in very different ways in the two contexts in which it's been presented. So in Meg's paper, that morality had a spiritual quality, and Alex's, it takes on more of a cultural and national-minded quality. I don't quite know how to phrase that. National-minded seemed about right, though.
That's good.
Sounds good to me. Good. So what I want to do is address each of their papers really briefly, because I had a couple of questions for each of you separately, and then I wanted to address you both together to kind of get a conversation started. So Meg's paper is pushing back against the traditional understanding of medicine in the early Middle Ages. She's making a case for the importance of laymen and women in medical knowledge and practice by showing us that the boundaries between religious and lay were more porous than historians have assumed. And that's really important because in the Middle Ages, what are perceived of as professionally trained medical practitioners were religious. That's why that porous boundary is so important. So Meg is saying significantly that views of bodily health and a growing emphasis on self-care as having an effect on spiritual health were things that not only were the nobility aware of, but was also connected to religious transformations happening within the Carolingian Empire. There's a lot going on there. And I think Meg's discussion of the stomach, and I'm never going to forget the stomach as the king of the body, that was fantastic and amazing, and I'm going to use it forever. I think it makes the case of these processes being interconnected quite clearly. So my questions specifically for Meg are these. So your paper focused with a concern on excess, right? Excessive consumption and the spiritual connection to this. And what I wanted to ask about the spiritual connection to excess is a bit about the theory of what Hildemar is saying, and that's consuming too much or consuming the wrong things makes a person grow so weak he's not able to do any good work, right? And this also came up in, I think it was another handbook that was not by Hildemar, but someone else who was talking about staying awake during vigils and being drawn by that as well. And that seems to be a pivotal point on which there's a connection between spiritual health and the body, at least for Hildemar, or at least that's my question of this fact, what do you think Hildemar means? And what I want to ask is this an issue of one's spiritual health being tied to doing, like doing good works through the day, so making oneself feel incapacitated by excessive consumption impedes doing good works, doing prayer and schedule, staying awake during vigil, getting to mass, and so on. And this is what comes to negatively impact the soul. And what I'm not sure what I'm doing in terms of asking this question is if I'm applying the concerns of 16th century religious reformers for the idea of, do good works do anything for you, and salvation to a 9th century context. So I was really curious about that. A second question is to continue to focus on excess, where does fasting fit into this then, right? So is there a discussion of fasting versus excessive consumption in cultivating and self-guarding both and safeguarding both bodily and spiritual health? So I found that quite an interesting thing to think about, because this is all about eating too much. When you intentionally not eat anything at all, what happens to that? A last comment that I wanted to say before moving on to Alex's paper is, it's something that's kind of for both of you, and that's, in listening to this link about spiritual health and bodily health, I actually ended up thinking about Nancy Tome's Gospel of Germs, which I know the two of you have read, and so it was also very funny that you clarified, Alex, that your paper is all pre-gospel, gospel, germ. Other word with a G that I'm saying out loud. It's pre-germ theory. So your two papers actually made me think of a work that comes after both of them, with the idea of cleanliness is next to godliness kind of thing that happens in that period. I kind of was curious if either or both of you had thought of that work at all, or forcing toilets while you were working on the 9th century and the 19th century pre-germ theory. So Alex is also challenging a traditional understanding, historical understanding, in this case of epidemics in the history of public health, and where Meg is carving out a space for lay people, for these elite warriors in the early Middle Ages, Alex is making room for the individual as a crucial focus of study, often lost in macro views of populations and movements like public health reform. And Alex's focus on individual behavior and the advice that people gave one another to avoid catching plague or cholera or yellow fever in an outbreak while traveling abroad does a truly remarkable job of both preserving the different stances of contagionist and anti-contagionist theories and parties, but you do ultimately collapse these differences and let us see similarities in the practical tips given to the everyday traveler. So you're making a case for the idea of moderation, which both Meg and I are very familiar with, because as you mentioned, it's grounded in, it's a tenet of humoral medicine dating back centuries in Western medical theory. You're saying it's intertwined with national identity in 19th century Britain in a special way, and that leads to my couple of questions for you. The first being, right, so you make a compelling case about Northern Europe, and it's kind of an identity of the bracing cold weather and moderation being important, and this having a specific saliency in the 19th century. So what does this look like in Europe but outside of Britain or Northern Europe? Like, do you have a sense of how far this moderation as a practical tip of individual behavior extends beyond Britain and Prussia and the Netherlands, right? Which is a fair question, really, because I know you specifically said that's not what you work on, but I'd be curious if you do know, right? My second question is about fear and what is ordinary. So what I found especially fascinating here is that the advice given in a completely extraordinary situation of an epidemic, don't drink alcohol and keep a steady mind, would be so completely ordinary. And I do have to contrast this with what Meg did, where you were saying that your writers were trying to create a sense of urgency about things that were very ordinary, right? So you have like inverse going on. So, but anyway, Alex, with this idea of giving very ordinary advice in extraordinary situations, is this an example of human beings subconsciously or very consciously attempting to combat the terror and the unusualness of these extraordinary situations with normalizing behavior? Like, is that a subconscious or conscious strategy that's going on and a way to interpret what's happening here? Does this help us look at how people respond to epidemic outbreaks today, or people who are getting ready to travel to places with epidemic outbreaks, experience epidemic outbreaks today? And so I want to address you both together. The way that I saw Meg's focus on the Carolingian laity and Alex's focus on individual behavior is an effort akin to what Kathy Brown and Mary Thistle have put forward to historians of medicine a few years ago, was the importance of studying body work as a way to make the study of medicine a broader and more inclusive enterprise by considering care of the body in all kinds of forms beyond the traditional physician-patient relationship. Anything from trimming hair to barbers to other kinds of things. And Thistle has also situated body work within comparable frameworks, such as Monica Green's discussion of techniques of the body, or Sandra Cavallo's focus on artisans of the body. So body work is this category that keeps the multiple roles of what we would call the patient from disappearing from the story. Patients as sufferers, patients as clients. But what's, I think, important for this panel, patients as self-healers. And I can use the word self-care, is what you wanted to focus on in your paper. So I think we're talking about people as self-healers and self-care in the form of preventative behaviors today. And I think there are two sides to the coin of that. And I think one side is great and one side is possibly awful. So the great side of it is that the morality is vigilance and the hypervigilance. You both use the word vigilance, right, in terms of preventative care and being tied to morality. It does give these lay individuals agency before an epidemic or when they're not sick, right? It's something, it gives us as historians other individuals to focus on that we haven't before, which makes us think in broader ways about what is medicine and what does medical care look like and how do we define medical practitioners. I'm interested in your thoughts on all of that. It seems very positive. The flip side of that, the negative side, is that then if someone gets sick, right, were they not being moderate enough? It's their fault now, right, if we follow along those lines. So as historians, I'm curious to hear what you think of that. Like, if you see it also as there are two sides to that coin, and what that means, or what your thoughts would be on that. In a broader way, stepping back from the dark and light of the coin analogy, I'm interested to hear what you guys think about what it means to expand our definition of what medicine is, because I think that's what you're both focusing on, by focusing on habits and behaviors, right? And I'm also interested in hearing a bit about your methodologies and finding perspectives that challenge traditional understandings of the history of medicine, whether it's in the early Middle Ages or it's in the 19th century. So thank you both for such wonderful papers, and I'm going to stop talking now.
Thank you so much, Heidi. So now let's maybe take some time to hear from our speakers about some of those very interesting questions that Heidi raised.
Sure. Well, maybe could I just start with the this double coin that you target, both sides of the coin. Sorry, that you were talking about with hypervigilance, and then this assignment of fault or blame if you get sick. Because I think that is a really important point. But I also think it's a way of thinking about that problem. I mean, I'm just going out on a limb here a bit, but in a modern way, because to us, the idea of assigning blame or fault, I mean, it's always a bad thing, but it seems like we're blaming then the victim, right? And we have a sense of wanting to protect the patient. But I think in my period, in some ways, like assigning fault or blame to the individual is also empowering in a sense, because if there is fault or blame, you can address that fault or blame then by applying medical techniques. So if we think about it in a religious perspective, like rather than saying God has brought disease and God will remove it, if you as an individual have some fault to play for getting sick, you can also then repair that fault by seeking out, in that case, that's maybe when you would step outside of your own self-care and seek a physician or someone else to assist you in remedying that defect in your body. And, you know, again, like this close connection between the body and soul, it's not only that you're then seeking out care to repair your body, but in doing so, you're accepting a kind of humble stance and you're admitting that you've done wrong, and thus you're repairing your soul at the same time. So that can also be a flip side that is still, in some sense, empowering for the individual.
Yeah, oh no, I see that, yeah. So there's agency on both sides.
A little, I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at it from that perspective.
Does that work for the 19th century? If I got cholera, could I repair it in my soul at the same time?
It's a really tough question because people both observe that cholera affects poor people more. It affects Irish immigrants in various British cities more, and some people say, aha, you know, it's kind of divine punishment for the sin of Catholicism, or something like that. But they can't really believe that because they have to admit at the same time some number of rich British people also die of cholera. They can associate living in filth with getting typhoid, but Prince Albert died of typhoid. So I guess what I'd say is people hold these ideas kind of incompletely. They're part of a shifting set of understanding. You know, you might blame a cat for giving you plague, you might blame intemperate habits. You can kind of apply whatever one fits a certain circumstance, but nothing really stands, in my period, I would say, as a kind of totalizing explanation for epidemic disease, except for some of the most polemic medical writers. Did you want to?
Well, yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, just, yeah, I mean, I think that's important, this idea that if we're, the more that we're searching for kind of totalizing medical discourse, I mean, that we can't. I mean, there are these contradictions always, and seeing how then the patient, again, setting them in a kind of active role, how they deal with some of those contradictions in their lives is then part of this expanding of what we understand to be a definition of medicine. It's accepting some of those contradictions, which are hard for us to accept because, you know, they're not how we that's not how we want to look at modern medicine, right? We want it to be able to explain everything, and when it can't, you know, we want to, that's turning a criticism on it. But for people often in the pre-modern past, you know, there is more space again for some of these things to not be so totalizing. You know, disease can come, as one of my authors says, it can be punishment from God, or it can be as a kind of test to purify your soul, or it could be because, you know, you ate bad food and there's intemperance. And in some ways it's important to acknowledge all of those different causes, but the author then goes on to say, no matter what the cause, we can still treat it. So it's in a kind of accepting of like, well, I don't have all the answers, but it's okay to respond, you know, in a medical, rational way, which is in fact a big move in this particular text anyways, and at this moment around the year 800. Because it's not trying to say, well, we need to give a complete schema of which diseases are divine and which are from a humoral model, or we don't have to completely reconcile it. We can respond as human beings and repair what we can in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, in a similar sort of thing is what I'd say to the point, you know, I was worried about this point about moderation and you know, arguing that it has a special salience in 19th century Britain when, you know, surrounded by people who do earlier periods of history, you know, never say that anything is new. You know, one way I think of talking about that too is, you know, is the same idea that it's selectively the case that moderation is kind of jiving with a certain narrative of Britishness, and other times it's just typical advice that doesn't have that kind of cultural charge. So, you know, in particular, what I'd say to you asking about in other parts of Europe, you know, does moderation have the same kind of value? And I'd say, well, it does to the extent that Italian authors about avoiding the plague are still going to say eating temperately is a good thing to do in an epidemic. To kind of dwell with the same kind of relish on the very French-sounding dainties that you should not eat so that you will not get the plague. The British will link the idea that they have not had a revolution and everybody else has to the same kind of, to arguing why their society is uniquely unlikely to get epidemic disease. So it's kind of the same concept might be at play in different places, but what other things it happens to be aligning with changes it dependent.
Yeah, I mean, this was something that I was thinking as you were speaking as well, Heidi, which, is something I constantly grapple with in my work, is this idea of kind of what is, like, when can I say something is new? Because certainly moderation, I mean, it's not even new to the 9th century, this is something that had been stressed in late antiquity as well, and, to a certain extent in some Socratic treatises. But I mean, and then again, we see it in the 19th century, and it's like, well, then was it just all the way through? And, moderation is important, in which case, what are we doing as historians? Yeah.
Right.
But I also do think, like, surely we can trace these concepts in kind of peaks and valleys, and there are periods when it does kind of crescendo, and I do see the 9th century as this point where it is reaching more, it is reaching more of a crescendo, and that ties in well with your question on fasting, because in comparison, kind of the centuries that have come before, in fact, I see in Carolingian texts this emphasis on, fasting, it can be good, but don't fast too much. Again, you have to be moderate, because if you weaken the body through fasting, that's equally spiritually dangerous, because you can't do good works. And because you've taken things kind of to an extreme, and that can lead to pride, but also, you're harming the body, which is the partner of the soul. So, I mean, for me, the more those two are interconnected rather than opposites, where you harm the body in order to hurt the soul. If you decrease that kind of discourse, which I see is going on in the 9th century, and you're bringing those two together in a partnership, then too much fasting, it's hurting the actual physical health of the body, and that's having negative effects on the soul as well. So you've got to strike that kind of middle balance between being careful about what you eat, but not eating at all either. So
no, I think what you're saying about there's a kind of a discourse going on, but there are peaks and valleys, and it's different points of crescendos. I think that's a really great way of putting it, right? Well, and also that it has different valences, like in different places it works in different ways, but
apparently all of our periods, there's a
know,
crescendo
I
of
know,
moderation.
so-
well, I didn't say anything about moderation. I just said self-care, but yes, moderation is important in this.
But I mean, maybe that is a real, critique, and it's like, well, we can't be talking about it.
It can't be constant crescendo.
Yeah, moderation. I don't know, it's something that people maybe way or not.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
No, I was just going to say moderation. I think it's always a constant, and it's all the ideal to be achieved, and nobody ever achieves it. I mean, I think that right. The emphasis is probably there, crescendoing. I mean, volumes up on that a lot, but whether the population achieves that moderation in greater numbers at any particular time is the question, I guess. Right?
Yeah, and maybe the degree to which it is linked with the vitality of the state also changes a lot, because in 802, Charlemagne, after he's just become emperor, he makes all his subjects, male subjects, but all his subjects take an oath that says, you have to take care of yourself, because I, as the emperor, I can't look after everybody. So take some responsibility here. And that is a cool oath. I mean, it's this moment in which you see this, no, yes, you are linked into networks. Yes, these networks are very important, but you as an individual need to be vigilant. And if you're not, the health of the empire is at stake. And that is new, for sure. So I don't know if that helps as well.
Can I just follow up on that, actually, because the point about the state, Meg and Alex, thank you, by the way, for those fantastic papers, 1,000 years apart. It definitely felt like I traveled a bunch. And Heidi, thanks for conceptualizing it the way you did during your response. That was great, helped a lot. Meg, my question is to both of you about the state or about institutions generally, because as I heard a lot about self-care and responsibility, I kind of think of a more contemporary kind of neoliberal version of health as the responsibility of the individual, as opposed to the responsibility of the state or a public provision or of an institution. And you mentioned something about the kind of monks, and I wanted to know I want to know a little bit more in your periods to what extent these various institutions were able to provide or felt a responsibility to provide for others, and how much was an expectation that others had. And then Alex, more specifically for you, I was thinking a little bit about Virchow and the typhus paper in Upper Silesia, because he sort of uses, and he's kind of pre-germ theory at that moment, and is writing about, a kind of contagion theory, but as a solution being not so much morals and habits, but a kind of state solution that's tied to empire, again, for Prussia, that without democracy and jobs and retirement and, sanitation, the empire will fall apart. So I was wondering if you both might want to talk about that.
Sure. I'd say to that question, I guess one particular way in which state medicine rather than individual medicine looms as much more important in epidemic disease stuff is when you actually have an epidemic, where I think the kind of basis of thought would say there all responsibility goes away from you. You must surrender everything kind of to the power of the state, and which is why so many people have correctly argued that epidemics are a major way in which the 19th century state across Europe is growing. That even in a limited state like Britain, you have the novel situation in a cholera epidemic as early as 1832, as the historian Peter Baldwin perceptively points out, of government inspectors actually knocking on your door and saying, "And how are your bowel movements this morning?" Which is so much more involvement from the state in daily life than you would ever have in any other situation. So I do think there's a distinction between kind of preventative medicine and actually treatments of epidemic disease, where the state absolutely tends to take over, even as some of the kind of aspects of preventative medicine are also layered with understandings of performing national identity being an expectation of individuals.
Yeah, and thanks for this question. I mean, it gets into kind of some of the nitty-gritty of how we understand early medieval society, and this question, which I tried to kind of hint at, of, how much do we take monasteries at their word of, like, we are separating ourselves from unholy society, we're going to found this sacred ground, often, in the wilderness, and we're not going to have contact outside of it. And in fact, the Carolingians really emphasize that rhetoric because they want these, what they call kind of powerhouses, or what one historian has called powerhouses of prayer. The more sacred the monastery, the more sacred the prayer, the better for the empire. If the monks are praying on behalf of Charlemagne and his dynasty and the empire at large. But we really can't take that rhetoric too seriously because monasteries are, in fact, very implicated in the state. I mean, so one text that I look at is produced at this monastery of Lorsch, and it's a royal monastery. It owes, as its patron is the Carolingian family. And so I think, trying to make clear the way in which what is going on in monasteries is in some way reflective of, state impulses, if we want to call it a state in this period, but state impulses, and in fact that monasteries see themselves as, yes, they ought to maintain boundaries, but they are also there for the welfare of everyone. So we cannot read texts that say, well, monks have to care for other monks out of charity, literally, and rather we have to see that, well, as I tried to show with the plan of St. Gall, there's a way to read these as allowing for this permeability across this monastic boundary, so that people from across society, and not just nobles, but also peasants who are farming the monastic lands. Women coming in and saying, I can't have children, and monks actually advising them. So breaking down some of these strict binaries that we have, like male monks couldn't be helping female, lay women, or monastic and lay, or like, this is secular and royal, and this is monastic and religious. I think once we get rid of some of those, it helps us understand the role of institutions in this period a bit better.
Yay, thank you. Meg, I have a specific question for you to pick up on that, and then a question for both you, Alex and Meg. I really loved the layout of the cathedral, because is it really a cathedral?
It's like the whole monastery complex with the monastic church and
Yeah.
the areas where the monks live.
Because it was interesting how the bloodletting room was on the east side, and it was on the opposite side of the warm rooms and the sleeping rooms. So like they would be warmer. And so I'm just wondering if the monks were working with the architects or with builders in terms of where the layout is, because it's presumably going to be colder at the end of the day, and bloodletting really you have to pay attention to the temperature.
Yeah.
And how viscous the blood is. So there must be, it just seems like there's a whole kind of social conversation happening going on there. Really, really interesting. And that basically plays into your argument about the kind of social porousness of these identities. Yeah. But just kind of a question for both of you. And this is one that's historical. So I learned this from Tillmann actually when we were having a conversation about patience. And patience as a kind of moral, virtuous thing is like something that happens to you. It's a kind of passive. You're receiving. There's a kind of you can say more about this one. I'm getting it totally wrong. But I'm wondering if we're also seeing this long history of the patient being redefined etymologically too, because we don't really have that now. And again, this gets to Heidi's question in terms of long histories and who's responsible and the individual, but also the role of the patient. Meg, in your case, is the patient somebody who is obviously not passive, but is patient a word that is used?
Yeah, this is
And I want to ask Alex the same thing. Is a patient a word that people are using actively, and what do you mean by it? And does it have the religious connotation attached?
Yeah, that's such a great point. That's really interesting. I was thinking so much as you were talking, because I heard a talk recently. This is not something I've seen a lot of scholarship on when this term patient emerges. But I heard a talk recently where a person was arguing that it emerges in the 12th century, and it's that point where we have the university-trained physician. We have universities coming into being. We have this elite physician who is trying to assert his dominance in like the medical marketplace, that he is kind of at the top of the pyramid of healers. And the patient, then it's very interesting that at that moment, patient, as you say, maybe as a somewhat more passive role emerges. In my period, in the text I look at, I was trying to remember as you were speaking, the term that I remember for patient is those who suffer. And in fact, suffering is a very active experience for, in this early medieval religious milieu. I mean, to suffer is to perform, the suffering of the martyrs, the suffering of Christ. So, I mean, even if we think those who suffer, well, that sounds kind of like, oh, well, this piteous person in the corner. No, I mean, this is a very active role. So I think your point is very, very, that's very correct, that we're seeing just a totally different understanding of, even the person who is acted upon by the physician. It's not nearly as passive as it will become later.
Can I just very quickly interject and ask what the actual word is for those who suffer? What's the verb? Is it the same as patient? Is it categorization?
No. I have to actually check exactly which one. I just can give it in one text in particular. But is it? I have to check to be certain. But it's very interesting.
Yes, sorry.
I'd say the thing is with anytime people with epidemics are, the word patient is absolutely discussed. It's used in the 19th century. It's rarely used in epidemic medicine because you are not that often going to see. A doctor, somebody like you're rich and you have cholera, sure, a physician might come over, but I don't know that. You're not seen as a long-term patient. Epidemics are so defined by their fastness, velocity, and dramaticness. The kind of suffering patient is not an image that is traditionally associated with them. I think French is the only language I can think of where there's the word, where pestifere is a word that, plague victim is actually a concept, a word, a noun. Otherwise people would say victims of plague, victims of cholera, and mostly assume that they are dead when they're being discussed.
I don't know yes, as to the whole architectural scheme, it's not that there are separate architects who are producing this plan, but rather monks are working, it's probably actually produced by monks, so monks as architects in this case. And they definitely recognize the importance of bloodletting, in terms of heating, because in fact those little, if you can see those little circles in the corners, those are actually probably stoves. And that's actually a latrine, and out to the side is like a little kind of common latrine, because if you're being purged, you know, I come out both ends.
So this is sort of not a question as such, it's a little bit of a question. Heidi made this really great comment, if you guys could talk a little bit more about method, and I just wanted to push that a little bit more specifically, because I'm struck, again, through the last question, as we're looking at this piece, that this is also a question about art history. You know, when you're looking at these medieval documents, they have lots of different layers, not just the text in them, all these images that you showed us, actually both of you, because there's all these sort of newspaper images and paintings and things. So, and then architecture history apparently also comes to play here in both cases, because we have these sort of houses for quarantine. So I guess I'm just interested in pushing that question a little bit more explicitly. How do you come to terms with being a historian who also really has to be very conversant with these other fields? I was also thinking about food studies. I mean, food was not one of the explicit terms that Heidi brought up in terms of what organizes you, but these were mostly talks about eating, right? So how do you situate yourselves? How do you reach out to other, how are we going to tackle that?
Well, that is a tough and very valid question that I'm not sure I have a good answer to, other than, as necessary, I try to become aware of whatever scholarship exists on whatever question I'm working on. So if I'm talking about Lazaretto architecture, certainly these things are, the images I showed of extant Lazarettos are cool, and these buildings are things architectural historians do talk about. I think with things like, something I've certainly tried to do in my book is to insist that the history of quarantine has to be told from a variety of perspectives, so that much too often when quarantine is ever talked about in the historiography, it's an administrative history. What were the laws for quarantine in any given year? And the administrative history of individual quarantine sites is interesting, but I would say mostly insofar as it shows how unified a system it was across the Mediterranean, and it has to be told in tandem with the histories of, the testimony of individuals who performed quarantine in these places. So one must look at travel narratives, one must look at the way in which illness appears in travel narratives in the East, and talk about how that informs the entire kind of imaginative vision of so you do have to I think to talk about a border like this that impinges on so many different historical narratives, it does require kind of political history, cultural history, diplomatic history, medical history all together consistently.
And I would say, this is going to sound, but as a medievalist, we have to always, and we have been for so long, incredibly interdisciplinary, because we have so little evidence. So we have to take whatever we can. And yes, medieval studies is incredible. Art history, philology, text, anything we can get our hands on, we're using. And if you look at, say, people who are working on the 14th century and the plague, I really think they're providing a model for how to bring genetics into the picture as well. So, looking at DNA, bioarchaeology, all of this is right at the, at the forefront of plague studies. So moving between text and, physical remains of bodies. Medievalists often providing a model for other historians. That may be a little excessive, but.
I have a question for Meg about what you called mindfulness when you were talking about the Carolingian lay manuals, that they sort of prescribe or cultivate certain kind of practices and attitudes towards, I think, what you called the inner self. And so I was thinking about that term, which of course today has very specific connotations in terms of self-care and meditative practices, and sort of focusing on concrete embodied sensory experience that is often sort of somewhat contentiously linked to other aspects of health. There'll be claims that practicing mindfulness meditation helps you not get sick, that it mitigates pain, etc. And so I was curious in sort of choosing that specific term for this with those contemporary resonances, and I assume that you were seeing some parallels there. I wonder if you could just sort of elaborate a bit on what it meant to be mindful in the Carolingian period in terms of practices or attitudes, etc.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm also open to criticism if you don't think I can use this term, but I've kind of latched onto it Because what I like about it is this idea, which I didn't really get into in the paper, but these lay manuals are not just laying out certain practices or codes of behavior, or kind of a scheme of vice and virtue, which is how historians have talked about them generally. What they are, in my mind, are really laying out, what are you? You are a body and you are a soul, and that may seem like, oh yeah, we know people in the past were like bodies and souls, but it really gets down to the level of how do those two components of yourself fit together. And so I use the term mindfulness because I see these as being, I mean, the authors often talk, like, you should read this frequently, carry this text with you, like, I want to be as a companion to you, helping you in your life. So it's a very kind of intimate tone to the text. And I think that there is this, that you're reflecting on just who you are as a human being. What makes me up? How do I have an identity? And so I was using mindfulness to kind of generally refer to this reflective process that isn't tied specifically to thinking about yourself. I mean, yes, I want to argue you're supposed to think about diet and these kinds of things, but in general, the manuals are not about thinking of yourself in a very specific way. It's just about, in fact, reflecting in general on, you know, how you are, you know, come into being and how you're in the world. I don't know if you have thoughts on.
No, just curiosity. That's really interesting.
These are really wonderful papers. Thank you for them. I'm tempted to ask you to explain change over time between the 9th and the 19th century, but I'll resist. So I want to go back. Yeah, Heidi can sort of fit in between. I actually want to return to Heidi's point about moderation. Moderation is a continuity. I'm wondering if it's also a continuity that's in some way tied to class. I realize it's an anachronistic word in your theory in some ways, Meg. But I think you show us how it's the laity that's really concerned with moderation. And Alex, when I think about your period in the 19th century, I think about moderation and temperance in the context of alcohol, for example. It's the medical elites who want temperance to mean abstinence. The workers will often want temperance to mean moderation. So I'm thinking about the theme of this panel and looking beyond physicians. I'm wondering if you think it's fair to say that one of the things we see when we look beyond physicians is the way in which, for non-physicians, healthcare is seen not as replacing bad excess with good excess, but in fact is seen as a mode of sort of moderation between bad and good excess. That an accurate assessment from the bottom up.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that is there are lots of implications to that, and I think that feels right. That it, you know, it's definitely important to say it's not a replacement of bad excess with good excess, and that indeed that is a fairly good, from both elite medicine and kind of working class responses, a sort of consistent, I would say, just off the cuff line. I think it's a great point that moderation is tied to class. I think obviously this the John Charles Hall thing where he's saying the rich and vile dainties of the elite at the smokestacks of the poor, they're the same thing, is clearly this idea, you know, it's a very Victorian middle class assertion of morality against the aristocracy as well as working class ideas too. So, you know, this idea that middle class morals are everybody's morals, or they think they are, in the 19th century holds true. Certainly there, but I think you're right to hint that moderation as a response, you know, can be a kind of way in which working class people actually respond to or challenge, you know, that in the critiques of elite behavior during a cholera epidemic, working class people would say, you are adopting too strong a response to the malady and that's actually making it worse. So that an immoderate kind of harsh quarantine or harsh regulations that say, you know, all businesses must close and you must withdraw to isolation hospitals is actually spreading the disease. So no one really has a monopoly, I'd say, on the discourse of moderation.
Yeah, I think actually, I mean, as I was listening to your talk as well, I think, I mean, it's not really class. I guess it's more, it's a kind of like ethnic identity. I don't know exactly how I would say it. But that does a little bit come into play in my period because Anthemus's treatise is addressed to the Franks, and he actually makes these comparisons between the Franks have this, they have options, right? The whole reason that his treatise is important is because they can choose among a variety of foods. They have this wealth. Other people's, right, the assumption is they already, in fact, mentions one group in particular, right? They only eat meat and bread. And they seem healthy, but they're not really healthy, he says, because it's not about, again, it relates directly to choice and self-governance, because they're not making choices, they're just following traditions. So it's the very fact that in some ways the Frankish civilization has become a little, like it's in a class sense, it's separated itself from other societies, that means that the Franks have to exert their control and thus manifest their ability to make decisions among these options, which is interesting. It seems a little bit similar to stuff you were saying.
One last question. Thank you very much. I'm impressed that all of you have been talking about self-care without mentioning, well, you managed to do it without mentioning the theoretician of self-care and care of the self, Michel Foucault. So I was wondering if you engage at all in your work with Michel Foucault, and if not, why not?
Well, I would say, you know, I have to engage with Michel. I would say talking about the Lazaretto, which you know is a topic crying out for a little healthy dose of Michel Foucault. I think it's kind of interesting that Foucault uses the plague-stricken town as a kind of pre-modern analog to the modern prison, but a precursor of it. Something that is different. I think it's really interesting. First of all, the panopticon actually, the ideas that it has actually are always functioning in Lazaretto's. Lazaretto's transcend Foucault's all-powerful around 1800 kind of barrier. They're both before and later. But I think thinking through the way in which medicine and epidemics provide a vehicle for various forms of state power to be articulated is certainly a running theme in my work where Foucault is important.
Yes, I mean, certainly Foucault looms over so much of what, and so, I don't know, just to be very brief about it, I mean, I think it's interesting as well, I mean, not only self-care, but also what is particularly important in the 9th centuries is confession, which of course also influences, is something that pays a lot of attention to. And so this articulation of what you've done, you know, kind of on a day-to-day basis, and this recognition, this accepting it as a choice, right? That you have is an articulation again of, in some ways, this relationship. It's a response to this mindfulness of the body and the soul's relationship that then forces you to, okay, you've reflected on it, and now you have to articulate exactly how you have governed these two entities, how they have operated together in your life. And so I do think there is this very strong link between these two kind of important developments that Foucault is tracing.
Yeah, we have time for one more.
One last question. Yeah, so you both have habit in your title, and of course it's all about habits. I'm not from history myself, I'm from philosophy, and of course like we have different concepts of habit depending on where you look. And habit can be like whatever you need to actually support a virtuous life, but it can also be something going against the free will of your subjectivity if you look towards Kant more. And then of course you can, if you look further towards now, you could argue even that with these like mindfulness practices, that habit can be shaped so it becomes a defense against this kind of anxiety that you were mentioning as well. So I was wondering like whether there is the notion used habit, and is there any like explanation of how you make habit in some of these texts you look at, or like whether that comes up as a term or concept that people just take for given, that people understand what it is, because it is one of the most mundane things that we have. Yet it is a question at times what it actually does to the subject, and this interacts both with like the question of like how soul and body are connected. It also interacts with the concept of passivity and activity, and with institutionalization and freedom of the individual. So I was just wondering if there's any mention of that concept and what it means more technically.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure this quite gets at your question, but I did try in looking at Politeness, where I reference how he extracts this passage about eating. He takes it out of text that is talking about how monks should stay awake during vigil. So that's a particular exercise in which they should only be thinking about eating right before they're about to perform a vigil, right? In case you eat too much, you become sleepy, you can't stay awake. But then Politeness takes it out of that context and he inserts it in this manual, which is a manual for daily living. And so that is the construction then of a habit. I mean, it's not a habit when monks are thinking about the stomach before they perform rituals, but it is a habit if you're thinking every day before, as you eat a meal, like, oh, how am I reigning in my body now? How am I thinking about my stomach? So for me, I don't know, I mean, habit is very much, or thinking about habit is very tied in with looking at the actual textual practices of these people in the 9th century, where they're often culling kind of different statements from earlier texts and putting them together in a new context. And a lot of it is about creating these rituals. I call them rituals because they have this spiritual import as well. It's not just a habit, but ritualized habit.
Yeah, and I'd say a way in which habit is a particularly conceptually appealing way that people find to think about behaviors that can protect you against epidemic disease is the way in which habit tends to be a kind of conceptual opposite to caprice, being this characteristic that they associate with epidemics again and again with various different epidemic diseases, and they even use it to say, I'm thinking particularly, there's a treatise I work with a lot of a person analyzing whether some local epidemic in the Himalayas in British India is in fact plague or not. He says, well, one way we can tell it is because there's caprice going on here. And so the way in which randomness is so terrifying and habit is so regular means that cultivating regular behaviors is something very appealing that you can do, and it's why I would say it becomes so characteristic of Europeans in the East trying to firm up their national and racial and ethnic coherence in the face of the plague. They say, well, we do this shutting up thing, and to deviate from that is both to kind of become dangerously native in some sense, but also to endanger yourself physically, because habit is a kind of conceptual defense against epidemic contagion.
Thank you. We started a little bit behind schedule and it's high time for our coffee break, so let's thank our speakers.